In creating this documentary film, we relied on scientific research and studies conducted by specialists. We are not interested in fictional narratives or purely entertaining content, but rather in everything that could provide answers. How and by what means the grand polygonal structures of South America were built, why they were created, and who was responsible for their construction. When you see structures made of multi-ton blocks on steep mountain slopes, you can't help but wonder, how was this even possible? How were these megaliths transported to such heights? And then, how were they assembled so flawlessly that not even a blade can fit between the stones? The creation of this film was preceded by a long period of gathering information, processing and analyzing it, discussing it with those who share an interest in this topic. Scientific data, common sense, logic. We hope that this approach will be of interest to viewers who are fascinated by the mysteries of the past and who prefer to use the same tools in their search for answers. Welcome to the film series, Traces of Alien Technologies. Structures built using polygonal masonry have captivated people for centuries. Mysterious and grand, they attract countless tourists. And, of course, there are mysticism enthusiasts. They revere these stones and constructions, experiencing awe and reverence. There are indeed plenty of mysteries. Massive multi-ton megaliths. Masonry constructed without mortar, with perfect zero-clearance joints between blocks. The individuality of each block, sometimes even an excessive complexity, bordering on extravagance. The uniqueness of the structures. Architectural features that have no analogues in our civilization. And most importantly, everything is made of stone, with traces that spark unlimited imagination and allow for a wide range of interpretations. Cutting, melting, molding, casting. There is also no satisfactory explanation for the purpose of these structures. The craftsmanship of the ancient builders is undeniable. We can confidently say they had superior skills in working with stone. There are tens or even hundreds of thousands of polygonal blocks. Yet you won't find two that are identical. So, was each block crafted individually, following a unique blueprint? That's not how we build. We could, but the costs would be astronomical. And yet, back then, it was done on an industrial scale. It's no surprise that such questions attract serious researchers. Some seek methods for creating flawless joints between blocks, which sometimes weigh many tons. Some collect samples and conduct chemical analyses. Some test various techniques for stone processing, trying to take a step toward understanding how it could have been done. Others sift through thousands of photos and videos, studying the works of local archaeologists and historians in search of answers. Let's try to find answers to these questions as well. And since they are quite complex, we will start with the basics. Our focus is on polygonal structure complexes. These are indeed complexes. They include a vast number of diverse objects. And many of them do not appear to have a direct, or at least obvious, connection to polygonal masonry. And that's just what's on the surface. But we must also consider underground infrastructure, as well as subterranean cavities, both natural and artificial. How do we navigate all of this? What should we take as a foundation? First and foremost, we need to categorize them in some order. For example, based on features that can be assessed at first glance, on identifying characteristics that are visible to the naked eye. Many of these characteristics repeat from complex to complex, from structure to structure. In other words, they appear regularly, systematically. Others appear less frequently, and this applies not only to entire objects, buildings, masonry, aqueducts. It also concerns numerous details found on them. As we can see, polygonal complexes consist of numerous diverse elements. Buildings are present in all complexes. Terraces and platforms are also found everywhere. These objects are easy to identify. It is not difficult to distinguish the types of blocks used for the walls of buildings and the facings of platforms. Other objects can also be identified by their characteristic features: intihuatanas, rocks with carved recesses, niches, and openings. These groups can be distinguished without much effort. They have clear individual characteristics. And that's a good thing. It allows us to examine them separately. This way, we can discuss the unique features of objects belonging to a particular group, and the variations within each group. We will be able to trace their properties. And this, in our view, is the first step toward answering the questions: how, and with what means. So, let's categorize these objects, moving, for example, from the large and striking to the smaller and less noticeable. A funny task, isn't it? It might seem almost childish. After all, it all appears quite obvious already. And yet, let's give it a try. The first in this lineup, of course, are structures, facings and buildings. From a modern construction perspective, facing walls resemble typical retaining walls designed to prevent soil erosion on slopes. However, this function does not apply to the facings we see in Peru. Often, behind these facings, there is a rocky outcrop or a mountain mass. There is simply nothing there to erode, and nothing to protect from landslides. There are no roads, no trails. Moreover, such facings always have an inward tilt toward the base. This creates the impression that the wall is leaning against the rocks or an embankment. It is evident that these facings served a different purpose. Some persistently insist, that the terraces were used for agriculture. But many terraces are too small for such activities. Often, their construction includes sections that are difficult to even access. The next easily identifiable group of structures is buildings. These, too, are rather peculiar constructions. They have several architectural features that are not used in our buildings. For example, their walls slope inward. All openings in them are trapezoidal in shape. The buildings contain trapezoidal niches. Trapezoidal forms are, in fact, a signature feature of polygonal structures. And yet, this shape of niches and openings has no rational explanation. According to modern construction principles, trapezoidal doors, windows, and niches are excessive and even wasteful. Their construction requires additional, unjustified effort and resources. Another distinctive feature: none of the buildings have roofs. Nor are there any structural elements that would confirm the presence of roofs in the past. Wherever such elements supposedly exist, later modifications are evident. Polygonal masonry has been overlaid with additions made of rough stone, sometimes set in cement. These additions are a crude imitation of polygonal masonry. Let's consider this for a moment. For example, when we build a house, we construct external perimeter walls. And we divide the interior space into rooms with partitions. If these partitions are non-load bearing and do not support the roof or floors, they are made thinner. This saves material and maximizes space. This is so obvious that it doesn't even need discussion. Now, let's compare this with the construction of buildings in the Peruvian complexes. These structures have no shared walls. This is extremely inefficient. Every wall is load-bearing. But why? Why were they built this way, especially if there were no roofs? So, were these dwellings? No, they don't resemble dwellings at all. At least, not human dwellings. Of course, one could live in them if there were no other options. But calling such a place a home doesn't feel right. In fact, the indigenous people did not live in the remnants of polygonal buildings. They built their own structures nearby. And their construction methods are easy to identify: rough stone, small stone sizes, binding materials, partitions. Sometimes, they even reused polygonal blocks from dismantled and ruined structures. We must also consider that many of the rough stone buildings we see today are the result of extensive restoration efforts. And whenever polygonal blocks are present in these constructions, it is clear that they are out of place in the newer masonry. But what about the polygonal structures themselves? What were they for? Could some of them have been used for ritual purposes? That's also debatable, especially when their walls seem to enclose a rock formation. A rock, surrounded by remnants of masonry. Often with a double-layered wall. A strange construction, yet we see a whole series of such structures. They appear regularly. But why go to such great lengths to encircle a rock with multiple layers of masonry? We will keep this question in mind and set it aside for now. For now, let's return to the buildings. Polygonal structures most often have a rectangular shape. We could classify them into several subtypes. Single-room structures, multi-room structures. But drawing definitive conclusions is difficult. Most of these rooms have undergone extensive restoration, making it hard to judge their authenticity. As mentioned earlier, in the vast majority of cases, these structures have no shared walls or passageways, even when they are built on a limited rock foundation. In addition to rectangular buildings, there are those without straight angles, oval in cross-section, or round, like the cholpas. And again, a mystery. Why were such structures built, hollow, with tiny openings near the base? The official version states that cholpas were used as ossuaries for storing bones. Perhaps the indigenous people did use them this way. After all, why let a structure go to waste if it serves no other obvious purpose? There's not even a normal entrance, just a narrow opening. But was that their original function? There is, however, an entire group of structures whose design resembles that of cholpas. Dolmens. Yet, no one can say anything definitive about dolmens either. It remains unknown who, why, and how they were built. Returning to the structures. Besides rectangular and circular ones, there are also hybrid buildings. In these cases, a smoothly curving wall may suddenly make a sharp turn, forming a right angle. And here again, we encounter something unexplained. At the center of such a structure, an exposed rock formation. Such an element is found in almost every complex. It is easily recognizable by its characteristic features, a rock outcrop surrounded by polygonal masonry. And over time, its presence becomes familiar and even expected. As if it were a necessary component. As if it were part of something greater. Water channels and aqueducts are also essential elements of polygonal complexes. They can be considered an integral part of the overall construction. Finally, something familiar and understandable. Water flows, and you can drink, wash your face, clean your hands or feet, or even do laundry. In Machu Picchu, there are 16 cascading waterfalls, one after another. A perfect setting for daily life. And yet, if someone washed their clothes or feet in the upper basin, wouldn't the water in all the following basins become unusable? Yes, you wouldn't be able to drink it anymore. Or wash with it. So why go through all that trouble? Only the sound of flowing water remains, a soothing murmur, movement. There's something about it. Let's keep that in mind, it's worth it. Yes, water channels pose a problem. Essentially, the same problem as any other object in polygonal complexes. Because none of these structures fully match the functions assigned to them. The water flows, but why such elaborate meanders? Why go to such lengths, moving massive megaliths just to channel a simple mountain stream? Why struggle so much with rock outcrops? Why shape certain parts of the channel with such unreal precision? And why so selectively? At some points, they bypass the rock, while at others, they deliberately incorporate it. Clearly, water channels are not as simple as they seem. The water flows, but the context is too complex. Excessively complex. What about the buildings? We seem to have gotten sidetracked. A viewer might ask, will we see any normal buildings here? Human, everyday ones? Will there be doors? Windows? Any kind of roof, even a simple thatched one like the indigenous people used? No, there won't be. Nothing like that exists in polygonal complexes. They do not match any practical, human-oriented function. Neither entire complexes nor individual buildings. Not even once. In no polygonal complex will you find anything resembling human dwellings. Nothing that meets human needs. Nothing suited to human physiology, for that matter. Nothing except steps. But that's a separate discussion. These buildings do not fit the culture or needs of the people who later inhabited the region. Just compare the polygonal structures with the huts the indigenous people built for themselves. The contrast is striking. So why were these structures built at all? A good question. A valid one. An intriguing one. And asking the right question is the first step toward finding the answer. Let's continue. Let's analyze what these non-buildings were made of. What materials and elements were used? What architectural techniques were applied? Perhaps we will find recurring patterns here as well? We certainly will. Just look at the masonry. It is clear, even to the naked eye, that it varies. Even excessively so. The material used for the blocks also varies. Different types of stone were used, which can be seen visually. And this is confirmed by specialized research. For the construction of Sacsayhuaman, limestone was used. Its gray color is due to weathering, or patina. Freshly excavated limestone blocks have a familiar light yellow-brown hue. During ground-penetrating radar studies at the Sacsayhuaman archaeological complex, samples were collected, and the results of geochemical analyses were published on Igor Alexeyev's website, arcanafactor.org. Pisak. For the main part of the complex, studies conducted by Patrick Hunt indicate the use of andesite. Olente Tombo. According to research by Jean-Pierre Protzen and Patrick Hunt, pinkish megalithic blocks were made of porphyritic granite. The rest of the complex was constructed using biotite andesite. Machu Picchu. For the construction of this complex, the material came directly from the site itself, the mountain rock identified as gray or white granite. Beyond the variation in materials, polygonal masonry also varies in execution. Yet the quality of execution remains consistent, regardless of the stone's hardness. One more thing to note. When looking at polygonal walls, One gets the impression that those who built them had no trouble working with stones of different hardness levels or handling massive multi-ton blocks. There is a distinct sense of ease, even swagger, in the execution of these complex stoneworks. This applies to the transportation of raw stone for blocks. This applies to the configuration of joints between blocks. It often seems as though everything was created with a casual yet effortless stroke of the hand. Several distinct types of masonry can be easily identified. Single-row masonry using megaliths. There is also masonry without megaliths. There is double-row masonry, and several variations of it. One variation features full interlocking of blocks, where the backs of the outer and inner rows occasionally touch and partially conform to each other's shapes. Another variation has incomplete interlocking. In this case, the space between the blocks was filled with a loose material. There are also mixed masonry styles. Here, large megaliths are used alongside smaller blocks. Masonry can also be classified by the type of polygonal blocks used. The word polygonal comes from Greek and means many angles. Wikipedia defines it as a type of masonry constructed from polygonal stones, fitted together at arbitrary angles. This definition contains some questionable points, for example, the term fitted. The distinctive feature of the polygonal masonry we are dealing with is precisely that the sides of adjacent blocks conform to each other's curvilinear configurations. In the masonry we are discussing, adjoining blocks never have flat side surfaces. These surfaces are always curved to some extent. Often, they take the shape of a propeller or even a lens, concave or convex. The method used to achieve such complex surface configurations remains unknown, as does the method used to ensure their mutual correspondence. So the term fitted is highly questionable. And arbitrary angles is also, to put it mildly, inaccurate. There is no randomness at all. In reality, we observe strict, sometimes even rigid rules we will discuss in detail later. Clearly, the main source of these rules is the shape of the blocks used. In many cases, for reasons yet to be determined, the builders primarily used one particular type of block. However, there are also sections where multiple different types are combined. Why different block shapes were used remains an open question. There are many possible explanations. The specialization of the structure, material properties, the use of specific tools. Different methods applied both in the creation of blocks and in their placement. There may even be subjective factors involved, such as aesthetic or cultural, religious preferences. The way blocks are arranged in masonry significantly influences the overall appearance of a structure. Despite common features and seemingly shared construction principles, each structure has a distinctive look and can be recognized even from small sections. These variations can be classified as types of joints. Let's identify them. Honeycomb joint type. The defining characteristic of the facade here is the prevalence of 5, 6, or more sided profiles. Each receiving edge corresponds to a single matching edge. However, sometimes a 1 to 2 pattern appears. One edge connects with two others. The size of the edges is not standardized. Block joint type. The defining feature is the dominance of quadrilateral blocks. They are uniform or have only slight variations in height. Each block overlaps two, sometimes more, blocks beneath it, creating a bond similar to modern masonry techniques. The horizontal edges are almost always parallel, while the vertical edges have varying, non-standardized slopes. Free-form joint type. In this case, the perimeter of the facade does not follow a strict configuration. Edges can be straight, curved, or rounded. All of these shapes may be present within the same profile. A key feature is the use of a receiving profile shaped like a step with a sharp or, more often, rounded angle. The corner can also be marked by a short straight segment. These profiles typically extend across several adjoining blocks both horizontally and vertically. A single type of joint usually dominates in a given complex. This dominance, combined with other characteristics, such as block size and surface details, creates a recognizable masonry style. However, in some complexes, different types of joints appear in certain sections. For example, in Saxehuaman, areas with a predominance of honeycomb and block joints coexist. The free-form type is also present. Since these variations occur within the same complex, some explanations for their differences can be ruled out. For instance, the idea that different joint types were used due to varying materials does not hold, as the material remains the same. Theories suggesting different tools or construction methods can also likely be dismissed. So what remains? One possibility is that different sections of masonry had specialized functions. In addition to masonry with distinct polygonal characteristics, some structures within the complexes feature joints that are less precise. They lack the typical elements consistently found in the previously discussed polygonal masonry. Protrusions and sharply defined edges are absent. The edges of the blocks are not emphasized, they are barely distinguishable. The quality of the side joints also differs, many are not fully interlocked. However, their facades are often carefully finished. There is also a highly unusual type of masonry. It is built using stones or megaliths with only partially adjusted shapes. Let's return to regular objects. Next in line are niches and openings. They are easily recognizable because they have a standardized trapezoidal shape. The angles and proportions remain consistent or show only minor variations across different types of structures. This consistency is independent of the type of masonry. This raises a question, not about construction traditions or standards, but about whether these niches and polygonal masonry are actually a single, unified system. We observe that the upper part of niches and openings is always formed by rectangular blocks. Or more precisely, by a single rectangular block. The lower part is sometimes made up of multiple blocks. In many cases, it is carved directly into the stone blocks. This group of objects can be divided into subcategories: trapezoidal through openings, window openings, door openings, small trapezoidal niches, large trapezoidal niches. Rectangular niches and openings also occur, though they are quite rare. There are also hybrid variations of these forms. Where could such doors lead? Could they be built-in storage spaces under the open sky? As we can see, the niches and openings do not align with our typical understanding of what constitutes a window or a door. This is yet another reason to dismiss the idea that these structures served everyday, domestic functions. Although, of course, there is hardly a type of niche that a modern person wouldn't find a way to repurpose. Now, let's take a closer look at individual blocks. It seems that we will find recurring patterns here as well. In some cases, the blocks differ radically. Some blocks are completely rectangular. Others, while maintaining a mostly rectangular shape, have slight, even inclines along their sides. These inclines appear on the lateral and inner surfaces and may help interlock the blocks within the masonry. Even among rectangular blocks, it is difficult, if not impossible, to find two identical ones. What could this indicate? Was it really easier to custom make or adjust each block based on its specific placement? What could have prevented the use of standardized blocks, even when they were almost rectangular? Some blocks also have freeform shapes. Others are hybrid blocks, with a rectangular front face and irregularly shaped sides and back. The back surface of these blocks is not simply unfinished. It could best be described as rough stone, almost as if it were intentionally left jagged. This type of block was clearly used in terrace and platform facings. Its rough, irregular back was meant to anchor the block securely in the fill behind it. It functioned like the root of a tooth. In addition to standard, if the term even applies here, blocks, some feature additional details. Locks. Cylindrical and cone-like protrusions. Square protrusions. Holes and elongated grooves. Clamp slots. Geometrically precise cutouts. Animal carvings. Strangely enough, the last category bears a certain resemblance to the Nazca drawings. Despite the technical complexity and mystery surrounding these objects, the animal images on the blocks are relatively simple. They are minimalistic. They are stylized. And yet, they give the impression of realistic depictions, as if drawn from nature. Additionally, there are blocks with particularly complex configurations that stand out. If we continue examining the front surfaces of the blocks, we will notice that they frequently, or at least at regular intervals, feature elements that can also be categorized separately. Chamfers. Recesses. Protrusions, nubs, and several other elements, which we will analyze in detail in the next sections of the film. Finally, let's touch on the concept of so-called plasticity. Many sections of polygonal masonry give a strong impression that, during assembly, the blocks were in a malleable state, capable of filling the required volume. Currently, there are numerous theories about how polygonal blocks might have attained such a state. Concrete and geopolymers based on volcanic ash. Traditional concrete production through limestone calcination. Melting. The original hypothesis of radiation-induced creep. And others. Each of these theories is based on a specific mechanism for achieving a plastic state. But they also share a common feature. All of them suggest that the material used to create the blocks must have had the ability to fill some amount of free space around it. However, judging by the joint lines and contact surfaces of the blocks, this does not appear to have been the case. For example, when examining the junctions between the rock foundation and the masonry, we see that the rock foundation was always prepared. In every case, a seating area was created for the block. This would have been unnecessary if the block material had been plastic and capable of conforming to a tight fit on its own. If the blocks had been in a plastic state, they could have been placed onto the rock foundation with little or no preparation. But that is not what we see. Preparation is always thorough. Moreover, the configuration of the seating area is sometimes more complex than in polygonal masonry, affecting 3 planes. In other cases, the seating areas in rock outcrops are made exactly the same way as in polygonal masonry. This applies even when the blocks and the foundation are made of different types of rock. It should also be noted that the blocks have a configuration that allowed them to be installed in a solid state. There are no negative inclinations. Blocks that were inserted into narrow spaces had a wedge-shaped form. Another important point is this. Many joint lines between blocks are perfectly straight. In some cases, they extend for several meters. Such precision would be nearly impossible if the blocks had been joined while still in a plastic state. Repeated modeling experiments have demonstrated that, with a high degree of probability, joints between plastic blocks would always have some curvature. And this is true even for small blocks, so how could perfectly straight seams several meters long be achieved? We also never see irregularly shaped joint surfaces. They are always smooth to some degree. However, in unfinished sections of masonry, where blocks have not yet been fitted, it is clear that the side surfaces of the rough block stock have either a jagged stone texture or only minimal signs of processing. And most importantly, there are no observed cases where the inevitable effects of working with a plastic material are present, such as block material overflowing onto adjacent blocks, both on the inner and outer sides. Filling of gaps between joints. Block material seeping into natural cracks and cavities in the surfaces of neighboring blocks. In other words, the expected filling of free space, something that would occur when working with a plastic material, did not happen. This leads to a conclusion that sets strict constraints on the methods used to create tight joints and the variety of block shapes. That conclusion is as follows. When installed into the masonry, the blocks were in a solid state, one that retained its form.